Hello and welcome. I'm Tom Palmer. Tonight we're speaking about the making of British socialism. With me is Professor Mark Bevir. He is a professor of political science at the University of Berkeley. Thank you for coming.
It's a pleasure.
All right. So please tell me about your book.
Well, the book is about the making of British socialism, and it really focuses on British socialist thinking and practice in the late 19th century. And the main idea of the book is to try and break down stereotypes of socialism. So I'm suggesting that socialism has less, or had less at that time, had less to do with state intervention, with the organised working class, and it had more to do with radical democracy, with attempts to transform individual lives by, for instance, promoting simplicity and living in harmony with the environment, and attempts to promote social justice.
So the factors that you would typically associate with socialism are historically are not the ones that were actually in play at that time?
There were certainly some socialists who believed that the state should intervene more than it was at that time. I think very few would have seen it intervening as much as it does now. So that's certainly part of it, but I think what I'm really trying to do is draw a broader picture of socialism and suggest just how broad it could have been. So while some strands of socialism certainly were closely tied to the labour movement or did indeed advocate the state, others were much more committed to personal experimentation, communal living, alternative lifestyles, environmentalism and things like that. And they associated all of those practices and ideas with socialism and often in overt hostility to the state coming in. So there were a lot of non-governmental socialists who simply opposed all forms of government.
Anarchists?
Yeah, although often at that time anarchism was often seen as a violent ideology that believed in violent overthrow, whereas most non-governmental socialists were pacifists who didn't believe in violence in any form.
So what can a socialist today learn from this book?
I think they could learn that they could learn that ties to certain forms of social movements are in effect strategic. They're premised on the fact that those social movements share the ideals and values of socialists. They can also learn that ways of promoting social justice in a better world, such as, say, state action, are just that. They're just possible techniques that might or might not promote socialist values. So they can learn that the things that particularly here in the US, are often seen as the core of socialism, are merely means to ends. And they can learn to focus, therefore, on ends about how we can live in better harmony with nature, how we can live in better harmony with one another, and how we can promote a just society in which we can all live more fulfilling lives.
So those means might change in 40 years or 50
Absolutely,
years dramatically.
Absolutely. Indeed, I think they have over the last 150 years.
Yeah, so they focus on the end game and to possibly speak about the end motives and make those clear, because in most cases they're going to be appealing to a broad swath of society.
Yes, I think that's right.
Yeah, good.
I think the ideals of socialism are much more appealing. They're appealing to me, for instance, whereas I think most of the means by which socialism was alleged to be being promoted in the 20th century have very little appeal, including to me.
Would you agree that the media demonizes socialism in the United States?
Yes, I would, but I don't think the media is the original source of the demonizing of socialism.
And what is the source?
I think the source is the Cold War. It's the Bolshevik Revolution and the reaction to it. So it's really after the Bolshevik Revolution that you first get what I think is a false identification of socialism with any form of state action, which is obviously silly. I mean, if you think about it for one moment, there's no way that if the state intervenes, say, to take money from the poor and give it to the rich, that's socialism. If the state intervenes to, say, promote the interests of a ruling racial group, that's not socialism. So socialism is obviously not state action. But what you get in in the US, particularly in the media, is the sense that whenever the state does something, you can say, oh, that's socialism. So socialism becomes something that you can badmouth by identifying it with state action, when even though it clearly isn't that, as a moment's reflection shows.
Could you conceive of a form of socialism that is mostly based on very local community action and very local community authority?
Yes, I think definitely.
Is that not the ideal?
Yes, I think it probably is the ideal.
Yeah. But then it's so hard for that to come about. How do you make that come about?
Yeah, no, that is a very difficult question. I think it is very hard to make it come about. I think you have to hope. I think that one of the reasons it's hard for it to come about is not that it's difficult to imagine it working. I think the reason it's difficult, that it's hard to envisage a non-governmental or heavily decentralized form of socialism, is that we've come to rely on somewhat false forms of expertise. So we've come to believe that experts know best in a range of policy areas, including, for instance, economic policy, family policy. Some of those experts might want the state to act, others might be experts who tell us the market is the best way of going about things. But from the mid-20th century onwards, we've come to believe that a range of experts promoting state action or markets know best. And therefore we've come to think that we must be governed by that sort of expertise rather than rule ourselves in smaller, more local groups.
In general, it seems that people are becoming more private, and they're feeling that they can't really make a difference anyway on a broader scale, and so
yes,
they retreat into their private worlds and just sort of leave all that to the government. But if you're ever going to have real socialism, you really need the opposite, in effect. You need people taking control of and having influence on their food sovereignty and all areas of their life.
Yes, you probably do. Oscar Wilde, who was a famous British playwright and novelist in the period I write about, said that the problem with socialism was that it ate so much into one's free time. So early socialists like Wilde recognised the problem you're speaking about.
Yeah, it's a lot of work.
Yeah.
And it means that you can't just sort of check out and assume that things are being done for you. You need to do them for yourself and be involved. You know, we're all involved, or many of us are involved on a very local level in our school boards or on our school meetings and things like that. But when it comes to the broader decisions, we just assume that we're not going to have much of a voice. Or, you know, it always falls to the one person or the couple people, the cranks that disrupt the board meetings of the supervisors, things like that. So it's just unfortunate that people that they feel so powerless, basically.
I think I'll come back to my point about expertise there. So I think people do feel that a bit powerless, and I think they do think that it is time consuming. But I think probably the most important factor is they feel that a lot of these issues are issues they don't really understand, and that there are people who know better than them. Right. And I think we've developed a culture in which we accept that experts and social scientists know better than we do about how we should be governed, and I think that's a mistake.
Well, because everything's so specialized. All the scientists are specialized in all their departments, and knowledge is becoming divided up, and so we accept that. But really, it's not all that complicated, is it? Well,
in some areas, I think in some areas you clearly need the help of scientists. If we want to put into place sensible policies to protect us against earthquakes, it's a good idea to have scientists monitoring how likely an earthquake is, what we can do to prevent them. But in other areas, when you're responding to our action, let's say you want to know how families are likely to react if you give them more tax relief. Will they spend it and encourage economic growth, or will they just invest it, for instance? Then I'm not sure that experts do know best. I'm not sure that we can't just sit around and talk amongst ourselves and try and get a sense of what we think we are likely to do if we introduce that policy. So I think there's a distinction between scientists who offer us knowledge about the natural world and social scientists who purport to be experts about the human world. And I think there's a good case for paying some attention to, or paying more attention to experts in the natural sciences than there is for experts in the social sciences, because I don't think the social sciences are governed by laws in the way that the natural sciences are.
You can't identify, you can't break it down because every interaction is so complicated. Everything is going to be different. When you're dealing with individuals, every group is going to have their own unique needs and their own unique ways of dealing with them.
Yes, I think that humans are inherently creative, and because we're inherently creative, we're always capable of doing something that an expert can't predict, and that means that there's a massive limitation to predictability in the social sciences, and a kind of limitation to predictability that just doesn't exist in the natural sciences. So a glass or the moon can't decide to do something different, whereas all humans can decide to do something different for reasons of their own. And that means the objects we're studying when we're studying social life are just qualitatively different from those we're studying when we're studying the natural world.
The psyche and human nature is part of it, and you can't separate them. Yeah. So it's interesting when you read, say, archaeology. Many archaeologists who study primitive peoples, so many of them were Marxists. Mm-hmm. A lot of anthropologists were or become Marxists. It seems that when you study a tribal society and people that shared everything and didn't hoard, and all of the benefits that come with that, that those academics gravitate toward either an ideology like Marxism or just the idea of socialism. Would you agree with that?
I don't know. I think the European social sciences, in particular during the 20th century, tended to be the domain of progressive liberals through social democrats onto Marxists, irrespective of whether you're talking about anthropology, sociology, political science. I'm not sure if there's anything particularly that attracts anthropologists to socialism. But I think certainly if you study other cultures, it can denaturalize capitalism as a form of economic life. So we can take it for granted that capitalism is the economy around us. It can be hard to envisage something entirely different from that. Whereas if as an anthropologist you study something entirely different from that, it can make you more aware of the possibility that we could be other than we are at the moment.
Sure. It isn't inherent in our nature to be capitalist.
Exactly.
Yeah. In fact, you could say that it's inherent in our nature not to be capitalist.
I think you could say it's inherent in our nature to be all kinds of different things in all kinds of different places and at all kinds of different times. So it's contingent what we are, and we can choose to remake that if we want.
Right. So we can mold ourselves.
Yes, so a lot of the socialists I look at, particularly what I call the ethical socialists, would have emphasised the task that they described as making socialists. So for that, some of them had an idea of the kind of non-governmental societies they wanted to create. But what they really thought mattered was to make people socialists, because if you made other people into socialists, then those people would start to live in accord with socialist ideals, and then socialism of some sort would arise. And they were less concerned with providing a blueprint of what socialism should be than with giving people the possibility to make themselves and therefore the social world different from what it was at the time.
So the average viewer who is gravitating towards socialism, how can they change their life? What can they do in a capitalist society to affect change, to move toward a more socialist world?
Well, it probably depends, it undoubtedly depends on the kind of socialist they are. But they can, for instance, promote cooperative ways of being. You can imagine, for instance, just a small thing, but a surprising number of stores in America are actually cooperatives. REI, for instance, is a cooperative store. So you could systematically choose to shop at REI because it's a cooperative rather than, say, LL Bean, which is not a cooperative. If your socialism was one that believed in producers and consumers cooperatives of that sort.
Food co-ops.
Yes, food cooperatives would be another.
Right.
And you can also do things that now would be identified more with the environmental movement,
yes.
Designed to simplify your life, to treat animals more humanely. All of these would have been treated as a package of things that were closely allied to the socialist movement in the 19th century, and now are spreading practices, particularly in the American West.
But then it seems like we have to wait till things get worse and worse until, capitalism destroys our environment to make this happen. And ideally, we wouldn't wait.
Ideally we would not wait.
We would act.
Ideally, we would not have waited and we would have acted. I can get very pessimistic about the environmental prospects. No, that's definitely true. I'm not sure whether we have to. I'm not sure whether the real cause is, or the only cause is, capitalism destroying the environment. There clearly are environmentalists for whom the big issue is just how awful things are becoming now. And by that I mean that there are environmentalists, socialists, green socialists, for whom the problem is that capitalist production and the capitalist economy are turning the planet into something that's likely to be more or less uninhabitable for men. But there are also a lot of green socialists for whom the problem is not so much that. So it's not that it's becoming uninhabitable for man, it's just that they don't like what the way in which a lot of people today, particularly again in the US, live their lives, in terms of what that means for the way we treat animals, the way we treat the land. And that's not necessarily something that only became true once capitalism hit a certain point. So you can imagine that sort of environmentalism flourishing much earlier. So again, if you go back to the period I'm looking at, someone like Edward Carpenter, who was a British socialist of the time, he could not have imagined...
What year is this?
Sorry, this is like the 1890s. Yeah. And he could not have imagined that the planet would be in danger of becoming somewhere where humans could not sustain their current mode of existence. He could have done, but that would have seemed something that was very unlikely. But nonetheless, he could be heavily involved in things like the anti-vivisection movement. He could be committed to veganism. He could believe in growing his own food. He could even believe in making his own sandals because he thought they would liberate the feet. So you could have all sorts of environmental things that people can believe in and try to promote, even before capitalism is doing quite the damage it is now.
Is there a way to amend capitalism and fix it without, completely reverting to a socialist economy? It seems that people think in dichotomies, and that it has to be either capitalism or socialism, or that the USSR fell apart, and so that communism doesn't work. When some people might say that that wasn't even communism, that the Soviets called it communism for their reason, and we called it communism for our reasons, but in fact it was not communism.
Yes, I think there is. I think it's a mistake to assume that you have either capitalism or socialism. I think that's to treat both as though they are fixed entities and incompatible. In fact, part of the point of the book, if you think about what I was saying earlier, is that socialism is very variable. So the idea that there's a fixed thing that is socialism, I think, is false. And likewise, I think capitalism is actually very variable, and the idea that there's a single thing that is capitalism is also false. So what you actually have is a series of different practices, some of which are good for the environment, good for people living more communally, and some of which are less good. But it's not an either or. There's a spectrum of practices, and we can certainly introduce more socialistic practices within the setting of a largely capitalist society.
And you can do that without reducing individual motivation, which seems to be sort of the bugaboo of the average capitalist mentality, is that you're assuming that people will no longer be motivated to work if there's an equal sharing of resources.
Yes, I think you can do that without
how?
Damaging motivation. Well, for a start, you can introduce practices in which motivation is not particularly important. But more importantly, I'm not convinced that people are motivated in the way that argument suggests they are. Some people are some of the time motivated by straightforward financial considerations, but most of us make a whole range of decisions without really paying that much attention to financial considerations. When we choose who we want to date or marry, for instance, we often pay very, very little attention to financial considerations. A lot of people, when they're thinking about the career they want to pursue, at least at times, don't think about financial considerations. They think about their talents, what they would find fulfilling, where they want to live is also something that often is not primarily financial. So I don't think that it's clear that the only thing that motivates people is individual monetary rewards. So I don't think that making individual monetary rewards less attached to people's activity and work life would necessarily remove motivation for them.
Do you think that making money the focus of our society, the way we have done, is part of the major problem that's driving the environmental crisis?
Yes,
yeah.
I think it's almost a pathology.
Yeah.
And I think it's very odd. And I think, to some extent, of course, it's something that's worldwide, but I think it's particularly acute in America. I think a society that works as long hours as Americans do is just not something that's healthy. There's very little mandated holidays, there's very little sense of wanting even to get away from work. A lot of people are so identified, particularly perhaps of the generation just above me, and perhaps even including my generation, are so identified for large parts of their adult life with their career and their jobs, particularly actually successful people, that they almost lost sight of a world beyond that, which seems to me the wrong way round.
It seems like we invented this abstraction called money, and now we can't stop it.
Yes.
It's running the world, and no one can really slow it down.
Yes, that's definitely true, and I think that's. In addition to that, I also think people have come, again, particularly I think in America, but to some extent worldwide, people have come to fixate on careers. So careers, I think, have become overblown in importance, and other aspects of life, for large swathes of the middle class in particular, have become devalued in a way that's very, very unhealthy.
Well, status is something that motivates everyone, it seems, in every society. And I don't know, it seems status is associated with your career, and money brings status. So, status is a big motivator.
Yes, that's probably true. But I think that, as I was saying earlier, humans can create worlds in all sorts of different ways, and historically and culturally have done so. And it's quite clear that both historically and culturally, there are a range of societies in which status has not been attached to career or money. It might have been attached to things we don't like, perhaps, for instance, to birth, but it hasn't been attached to career or money. So there's no necessary connection between status and those things. So you could imagine a society in which status is tied to things such as how you spend your leisure time.
Well, sure, there have been societies all over the world where status, could be how many rings you have around your neck. Status can vary from society to society. The trick is, how do you change what brings status? I think, if you could change what brings status. In a primitive society, often the potlatch or there was a ceremony where the more you gave away, the more status you had, and that seems to me that's a very healthy way to that's a great tradition as far as status making goes.
It's a nice idea, isn't it? The more you give away, the more money you hand over to the state, the more status you have. I think that. I mean, it's a difficult question to try and come up with ways in which you change things. I mean, this is one of the things so if I projected what I was doing in the book as an attempt to rethink socialism in a way that gets it away from the historical narratives that came to dominate the late 20th century, then one of the benefits of my doing that is that I open up this broader notion of socialism, which includes other things. One of the costs is that a lot of socialists in the mid to late 20th century thought history was on their side. They thought that history was more or less inevitably leading to socialism, that, for instance, that the rise of capitalism would create an organised working class. The organised working class would get political power, and it would introduce socialist reforms.
That's how Marx had it, isn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the things that happens if you rethink socialism as I have is that you have a broader concept of socialism, but you lose confidence that history is necessarily on your side. And that means I haven't really got a great answer to how is history going to bring socialism into being, because I think that it's contingent. And that means that I am left falling back on a position more like my ethical socialists, where I think that what's important is making socialists. So I think the way that we change status is actually by thinking we want to change status and or change what status means, and convincing other people that they should think about status differently. And if everyone comes to think about status differently through that process, then status will mean something differently. And that's a very kind of contingent process. It's dependent upon other people coming to believe something loosely akin to what I believe. And I have no kind of magic card to pick out and say, oh, this is how it's going to work.
Well, I think it's difficult when the corporations own the media, and all the presentations we're being given of a highly functioning person is someone with their own jet, or someone, who's living large. All people are just awash in media these days, and all of the messages they're getting are very counter to what we're talking about.
Yes, I agree entirely.
So maybe we need to get our bodies in front of the machines. I don't know.
Right.
It seems at some point you need to stand up and really do what the Occupy movement is doing. Throw your body into the gears and stop the machine.
Yes, I also think that when people leave media behind and engage in what activities that we might think of as hobbies, they actually find that other things are fulfilling, and they come to treat status and rewards and as tied to other things. So if somebody, I'm not, but if somebody gets heavily into, say, mountain biking, they can often then come to find through that other things are as important as work life, that other things matter to them, that they have other values. If somebody gets into something like hiking, they might from that then get into the Sierra Club. So I think you're right. I think we do need people to kind of detach themselves more than they often do from the media. But I don't think that necessarily has to be something that happens through organised or even less well organised political movements such as the Occupy movement. I think it can also happen through a range of what we might think of as more leisure-based activities.
So what are you working on now? Do you have another book that you're in the works?
I do. I'm working on a book called Governance, A Very Short Introduction, which will come out this winter.
Ah. Is that a course you teach at the university?
I have taught a course on theories of governance, so I do teach things on governance, but I haven't actually taught this book as a course, though I might start to use it for the theories of governance course, which I'm teaching again next spring.
What are your courses at UC Berkeley?
I mainly teach governance and political thought.
So, people who are attracted to socialism but have been hearing it demonized their whole life, what's a good reading list? What should they read, perhaps?
Apart from my book, you mean?
Apart from your books, of course.
I think there's a lot to be said, at least at first, for reading something like, say, William Morris's News from Nowhere, which is just a literary socialist utopia. I also think that they should think about reading something that might not normally be associated with socialism but evokes alternative ways of life, say Thoreau's Walden Pond. I have a chapter in the book on the influence of American Romanticism on British socialists.
The Transcendentalists?
Yes,
yeah.
and a lot of them were picked up and used as the inspiration for socialist ideals.
Yes.
Certainly Thoreau, also Whitman, less so Emerson.
Yeah.
So those would be good sources. Same with something like Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, which if it had been written and produced in a European context would have been regarded as a socialist or at least social democratic novel. So that would be another good thing to read. And often these literary works are excellent ways into socialism.
The Jungle. What's the book, The Jungle?
I don't know that one.
Oh, there's a great book.
Okay. I should add that to the list.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good.
And I guess if they were looking for theoretical works, if they were interested in Marxism, I think the easiest text to start with would be Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto.
Right. Short and to the point.
Short and to the point.
Yes.
And I think if they wanted more recent works, then there are so many it would be hard to pick out. I like things like Bookchin's more ecological socialism. Then there are the classics of social democracy, like
Murray Bookchin, good.
Anthony Crossland's works, or Edward Bernstein from Germany. But I would start with the literary works I mentioned. I think that's
good.
Helps to get across the message I was saying earlier about a lot of what socialism should be is imagining alternative ways of living.
Yes.
And often literary figures are are much better at helping us to imagine alternative ways of being than our theorists.
Good. All right. Well, thank you, Professor Mark Bevir.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you for coming. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
All right. And thank you for watching. Good night.